Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to tell you about Wisdom. Wisdom is a social audio app that allows you to join into conversations with experienced mentors. Mentors in what, you might ask? Really just about anything. With categories like education, arts and hobbies, wellness, business, and sports, you'll be able to find a mentor on a subject you love, and you'll be able to interact directly with them. It's kind of like an interactive TED Talk. And as of today, you'll be able to find me on the Wisdom app. In fact, my first talk will be today, Monday, December 6th at 9:30 p.m. Pacific. I'll be discussing the balance between accepting constructive criticism and retaining your own creative control. It should be a blast. Download the Wisdom app today and find me at Obscure History Josh. I'll be posting reminders on my social channels, so keep your eyes peeled for more details. "'Tis the season to be jolly." Santa has officially replaced the jack-o'-lanterns and Thanksgiving turkeys on store shelves, and Mariah Carey is once again blasting on every terrestrial radio station in America. Whether your Christmas is religious or not, it seems that, generally speaking, we have a sacred reverence for Christmas time here, which is great. But when something goes wrong around the holidays, the context only amplifies the damage. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. Once, long ago, before you and before me, there was an enchanted land. Trees of orange, red, and yellow cast their shade over tall swaths of grass as creatures scurried around in the undergrowth. It was a thriving world, giving of itself bountifully. The Great Lakes nurtured this land like a seed, lapping life-giving water at its shores until wildflowers gracefully erupted from the soil to paint the rolling hills. And after each brilliant summer, the winter would once again come and paint the world white, like a blank canvas ready to receive paint. For millennia, this cycle persisted, the natural order. Eventually, small indentations began to appear in the soft, mossy ground. Few at first, gentle feet and hands that cared for the land and respected its power. And this continued for thousands of years, a harmonious coexistence. However, this was not to last. More indentations began showing up like a pox on this beautiful landscape. Wagon wheels leveled swaths of wild grass, foundations for logging and mining camps leveled the earth, and eventually, human beings were an inseparable part of this landscape and its natural order, for better and worse. Though similar stories can be told in generalized terms about most places on this blue and emerald sphere, our lens finds its focus today in the northernmost point of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in a town called Calumet. With a current population of less than 1,000 residents, it's a small place with a very large story. In fact, it wasn't always called Calumet. When it was originally settled by immigrating Atlantic families, it was called Red Jacket, after a highly respected chief of the Seneca people. Red Jacket transformed from a small village to booming mine town after the discovery of rich copper veins in the area. In the 19th century, Michigan was rapidly changing in many ways. In the decades and centuries prior, it was a frontier territory, a place for hunters, trappers, and survivalists. In 1840, Douglas Houghton, state geologist of Michigan, published a report on the geology of the Upper Peninsula and described the Keweenaw's copper deposits. He urged people to be cautious about exploiting the land for its mineral deposits, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. Investors and entrepreneurs immediately jumped on the opportunity to buy up large portions of this mineral-rich land. Only 2 years later, the Ojibwe signed the Treaty of La Pointe, surrendering their abundant resources in the Upper Peninsula to the United States. About 2 years after signing the Treaty of La Pointe, the town of Clifton was established and proved to other real estate investors that the Upper Peninsula could sustain a profitable mining operation. Clifton was the example of what could happen to an investor. By 1870, it had produced about $2.5 million of profit. Naturally, after seeing its success, other investors sought to capitalize on similar opportunities. It was around this time that the Boston-based Calumet Hecla Mining Company moved into Red Jacket and would become such a pervasive part of its identity that people simply started calling it Calumet, until the name was legally changed. There's a stark contrast in the world. The earth gives freely, and we take what is natural and then refine it into an engine. It's foolish to suggest that we should never commoditize the natural world because shelter and infrastructure are critical to our survival. However, it's particularly despicable that oftentimes that which the earth provides for free is not simply harvested and sold, but is used to crush and exploit. As can be observed in many other industries, the large mining companies like Calumet Hecla tried to maximize their profit margins, even if it meant sacrificing their employees' safety and well-being. Their first attempt at this came when they disbanded the 3-man drilling team in favor of the 2-man drilling team. This is both a product of advancements in drilling technology and a desire to maximize profits for the company. This change was unpopular, but the miners continued to trudge on. That is, until the 2-man team was disbanded in favor of the 1-man drill. This not only put miners out of work, but it also meant that if there happened to be an accident, it wouldn't be discovered for several hours. This outraged the miners. The second major exploitation came from the labor expectations that were placed upon the miners by Calumet Hecla, and the manipulation of wages it used to keep profits as high as possible. Miners typically worked 10 to 12-hour shifts in the mines with 1 day off per week. Although the old contract system remained, most mines manipulated contracts so that all miners made effectively the same amount per month, subtracting expenses for candles or lamps, or steels used in drills and other materials required for mining. Additionally, the mines often hired children to help supplement their family's income. This is highly problematic for many reasons, but primarily because mining is a very unsafe job, especially at this time where new technology was being implemented rapidly and not always as safely as intended. The final exploitation is much harder to quantify and is quite possibly the most important. There was a very clear pattern of systemic racial inequality in the Michigan copper mine system. The turn of the 20th century saw a dramatic spike in European immigration to the States. These immigrants, coming from places like Ireland, Finland, Slovenia, Italy, Germany, Norway, and Sweden, struggled to find a place in American society and were often denigrated to the lowest social castes. As such, many European immigrants found work doing dangerous manual labor, like mining. This snapshot of the Calumet workforce comes from a 1911 report and gives us a very compelling picture of what things were like. It says, immigration to the Copper Range started in 1844 with the arrival of the Cornishmen, who preceded other foreign races in the successful operations of the Lake Superior copper mines. The Cornishmen, having been miners before their immigration, carried on their work successfully and in many cases made large fortunes. Their descendants are now living in the region and are as thoroughly Americanized as the Native American. The Cornishmen were followed by the Finns, who have made great progress in the district. They, for the most part, occupy laboring positions, and have not been so successful as were the early Cornishmen. The other races, The Scandinavians, the North Italians, and the Poles, which have been in the community only a few years, are working merely as laboring men and are making little progress beyond that position in life. Furthermore, an observer of the district, Charles T. Rice, made similar remarks in 1912. He says, "It is odd, however, that there has been a considerable exodus of the Irish, and to a lesser extent of the Cornish element to Western camps, and as a result there has been a steady increase in the number of foreign employees on the payroll of the companies. This condition is hard to account for. Most of the machine men are Cornish, with Irish and Americans and Italians and Finns, in the order named, making up the balance of the drillers and timbermen. The trammers are generally Finns and Croatians, but of course there is really no division of labor according to nationality. The Cornish miners are no longer in power in the district to the extent that they were formerly, when most of the mine captains were Cornish." While Rice notes that there isn't an official designation of job duties by nationality, he does make it clear that there were unofficial designations, and this preference for certain nationalities was only exacerbated in the town. Like many mine towns, the mining company provided housing and schooling for miners and their families, as well as medical care and even the construction of roads. Houses were assigned with preference to miners and other skilled laborers, as opposed to trammers, and to men with families, as opposed to single men. Additionally, most houses were given to certain favored ethnic groups, especially non-immigrants and Cornishmen. These frustrations built up in the miners for decades, and these conditions weren't exclusive to Calumet. Mines all over copper country had similar complaints. There were attempts to strike, to demand better conditions, to fight for the humane treatment of the miners, but they were all for naught. None of the strikes were able to fully impact the management at Calumet Hecla and the other large mining firms. However, that would all change in 1913. But before we get to that, we need to pay the bills, so hang tight for about 90 seconds or so, and when we return, we will dive deeper into this tale of conspiracy, chaos, and copper. In 1913, the Western Federation of Miners began making serious progress. They were able to unite workers in Michigan's copper country against the large mining companies that governed their fates. And once the strike was announced, things got ugly quickly. After the first day of the strike, nearly all mines in the district were closed down, with mobs of strikers blocking access to the mines. The strikers held daily parades in those early days to boost their morale and make their voices heard. And while the strikers danced in the streets, the management of the mines sought help from the National Guard and the governor of Michigan. On October 23rd, National Guard General Abbey sent the following correspondence to Governor Woodbridge Ferris in an attempt to garner more aid to quell the rebellion. He writes, "Lawlessness broke loose throughout the district today. Northwestern train windows smashed with rocks. 30 men broke into workmen's homes at Quincy. Row with deputies at Quincy. Paraders at Calumet armed with clubs. 3 fights. 2 deputies badly cut up. 13 strikers arrested. 4 arrests near Amique for shooting up workmen's premises. 2 arrests at Aloise. Picketing throughout the entire district." It's unclear if these things really happened. In the mayhem of the strikes, accusations of all sorts were hurled in every direction. Just as the mine management and National Guard cried foul, so too did the strikers. Disregarding the numerous unfounded allegations, we do know that things did get bloody, eventually. On August 14th, 1913, 2 strikers, John Kalin and John Stymick, walked across a portion of the mine's property. They were warned by a deputized mine manager named Humphrey Quick, but they ignored his threats. They went back to their ramshackle boarding house and not long after were confronted by a mob. When they refused to leave their boarding house, the mob opened fire. Stymick and another man named Stanko Stepich were wounded. 2 boarders with no connection to Kalin and Stymick were killed. Aloy Tion died on the scene and Steve Putrich died the next day. Their funerals were attended by thousands of sympathetic strikers. This only intensified the strike, but in addition to this very heavy personal loss, the strikers were also losing traction as Calumet, Hecla, and other large mining companies began importing new workers from neighboring states and continued to hire immigrants who were new to the area to work in spite of the strike surrounding them. They weren't able to operate at full capacity, but they were moving on. The WFM was running low on funds, and the strike seemed to be waning. With what remained of their funds, the WFM threw a Christmas party for the strikers and their families. This was a particularly kind gesture as many of the strikers had been unable to make ends meet after entering the strike. The Christmas party was held on Christmas Eve in Calumet's Italian Hall. The two-story red brick building, with its warmth and life, must have looked like a shining ruby that night. It was full of families that were in the same fight, even if they didn't speak the same language. They knew that they all had the same inalienable rights, and they stood around a glistening Christmas tree in a holy union, in reverence of their God and the strength of the human spirit. The party was well attended, and laughter filled the chilled Michigan air. And then, suddenly, a voice shrieked from the crowd, "Fire." And then, the unthinkable. Those in attendance began fleeing from a fire that did not exist. As the party was being held on the second floor, the massive bodies surged towards the staircase, and sadly, it surged over top the smaller and weaker partygoers. In a matter of minutes, the party had been evacuated, but as the families reunited, they began to notice that many people were unaccounted for. They went back into the hall to search for their loved ones and found a ghastly sight. Bodies everywhere, trampled to death, desperately trying to flee from a fire that never was. In total, 73 people were killed that night. 59 of the victims were children. Coroners, gravediggers, and clergy from neighboring cities were brought to Calumet to help process the aftermath, as those that already presided there were unable to do it on their own. As people struggled to piece together the events of that tragic night, one detail kept recurring. Though they could not identify the person who yelled fire in that crowded community center, those who saw the individual all agreed that on their coat was an anti-union button. Perhaps this person could have been identified further or even apprehended, if not for the fact that when the police began investigating, they demanded that those witnesses testify in English, which was something they were unable to do. And because they couldn't testify before their police, their loss was treated as a casualty of circumstance. It wasn't until a year later when the federal government got involved in the investigation and interpreters were offered to the witnesses that the anti-union man was even recorded at all. And though it's all circumstantial, all 8 witnesses who claimed to have seen the man call fire agreed on the general description and to the presence of his button. The tragedy was ultimately fruitless. Though having 9,000 members at the beginning of the strike, the WFM only had about 2,500 when they voted to conclude their strike. Those who sought employment in the copper mines after the strike were required to destroy their WFM cards and were often met with harsh treatment. In fact, it would take another tragedy to make any progress in the unionization of workers in America. It was only after the Ludlow massacre, where 21 striking workers, their wives and children, were intentionally murdered by the National Guard at the behest of John D. Rockefeller, that labor reform made any real progress. By the 1940s, miners' unions found strong footing in Michigan. Though it could never make up for the loss of those 73 lives, Calumet and Hecla closed its mines in 1969 after failing to reach an agreement with its striking employees. And so here we are, at the end of this tale. And its ending is grim. I've tried to rewrite it and rework it so that it doesn't feel like a funeral at the end, but I don't think I can do that. Sometimes history is the study of human misery. Much of the time, it's the study of human misery. But remembering these parts of our past is critically important because though we have made great strides in labor reform, there are still hidden corners of our nation where hardworking people are being exploited. And if we forget the tragedies of the past that help shape our present, we do run the risk of repeating those mistakes. I once asked a history professor of mine, "How do you deal with studying history all the time when it's so depressing?" She responded with this pearl of wisdom that I will now pass on to you. Drink lots of water and watch good comedy. So as I go, fill up your hydro flasks and follow the link in my show notes to watch one of my very favorite comedy videos. I hope you appreciate it as much as I appreciate you. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.